All right, we're back with another installment of our manufacturer series, and this time we're going to be looking at the newest, latest released motorcycle from every manufacturer. Now, just to clarify, we're focusing on actual new motorcycles, not just bikes that have been updated or maybe special new versions of already existing models. So, as an example, the Chrome editions of the Bonneville, those aren't the kind of bikes that we're going to be looking at. Also, something like the new Panigale V4R isn't going to make it either. We want to look at, pretty much all new motorcycles, or at least mostly all new ones, as we continue on. Obviously, many new motorcycles come from already existing parts or platforms or engines, and that's okay, right? There haven't been too many companies that have made entirely new motorcycles from the ground up in the past 10 years or so, but a new motorcycle that, say, shares a frame with another bike still counts. So, without further ado, let's jump in. Now, let's start with Norton. Now, I'm sure many of you know and have followed Norton's somewhat tumultuous past, 15, 20 years or so. The company was recently acquired by TVS and have recently released an updated version of the V4 SV, which I believe was the V4 SS before. Now, this is not an all-new motorcycle. This is pretty much just a re-engineered version of that, high-end sport bike. Though built on the same platform and essentially the same bike, the V4CR would have to be considered the latest model from Norton. This is technically a prototype at this point, which I do kind of want to avoid for this video, especially for the bigger companies who release new models almost every year, but for a company like Norton, it's a bit difficult, and this does look like a motorcycle that will actually make it to production in some form. Now, this bike is interesting. This would be the most powerful British cafe racer that money can buy, and I'm guessing you'll need a lot of it to buy this bike. This is essentially their V4 SV with a more stripped back look, so I would assume similar power figures unless they, tune the engine for lower end torque pretty aggressively. I have to admit, for this class, this sort of crazy high-end street fighter class, which would include bikes like the MV Agusta Brutale and Rush 1000 and Ducati Street Fighter V4, maybe you could also include the Speed Triple RS. This, in my opinion, has to be one of the better looking options with a more retro flair, and this is an expensive class, especially if you look at like MV Agusta's, hyper naked bikes. So this is going to be expensive, but it's really not that much crazier probably than MV Agusta's options. But yeah, pretty cool bike, and it's got a nice retro flair. The latest all-new motorcycle from BMW is the M1000R. Now, if you don't already understand BMW's motorcycle lineup and how to decode the letters and numbers, the simple way to understand it is that the first letter identifies which motor is used, or which type of motor, and then the number is the displacement, and then the letters that come next refer to the type of motorcycle. So for example, G refers to their single cylinder line, F is the parallel twin, S is that inline four, and then M is like the high performance version of the inline four. There is still tuning happening between some of the letters. For example, an S1000RR and an S1000R make very different performance numbers, with the S1000RR being BMW's sort of flagship leader bike, making over 200 horsepower, and then the S1000R is the naked version of that bike, and honestly doesn't really compete in terms of power output with most leader bikes or with really any of the bikes in its class. So BMW has just released this all new hyper naked bike, the M1000R. Again, that would be the high performance version of their big inline four, but this time in a naked hyper Street Fighter package. Basically, this is the new truly competitive Street Fighter made to stand up against the likes of Ducati's V4 Street Fighter, a lot of the bikes we just mentioned, the MV Agusta Brutale 1000. This bike makes 207 horsepower and weighs slightly more than the Ducati V4 Street Fighter. I mean, that bike is the king of this class, if we're being honest. This bike is really cool looking though. It's aggressive, it's pretty expensive, and in all honesty, you'd probably be much better off just getting an S1000R with, only 160-ish horsepower, as if that's not enough horsepower for the street. That's going to fit the street much better than this bike and probably be more enjoyable, but you'll technically have, what people would consider like the turd of its class in terms of power. It is pretty ridiculous that a bike like this gets shot down. I think it's so stupid that we count these numbers when all of these bikes are just unbelievably fast and make ridiculous amounts of power, especially for not being a sport bike. Like, you have no fairing. You're just out in the open on this naked bike that makes liter bike power. But anyways, M1000R, newest bike from BMW, and pretty nice. All right, on to Ducati, and without a doubt, the newest model released from the great Italian manufacturer is the Desert X. Sure, the Diavolo V4 is technically speaking a new motorcycle, but to me the Desert X is more all new, if that makes sense. This marks a pretty bold entrance into a new market and class for Ducati. I know that technically they have had adventure bikes, but not to this level. The Multistrada, in my opinion, is much more of a sport touring bike. You can get certain versions that are, I guess, more off-road, but I don't think people are really taking their Multistradas off-road that much. And this bike, the Desert X, is in some ways a better and more interesting, more nuanced approach to making an adventure bike, even than, Harley's recent entrance into this class. That's just my opinion, but I like these kind of Dakar bikes. I think they're cool. Ducati is obviously known for making exotic, beautiful, tech-focused, high-performance sport bikes, and sure, a lot of that DNA is definitely there in the Desert X. And they do have some off-road sort of bikes, like some of the Scrambler lineup could be taken off-road. But those bikes are not leaders in their class the way that the Desert X has the potential to be. In terms of styling, the Desert X has that Dakar look. Ducati has a long history in Dakar racing. The styling is more in line with another bike on our list, but I would also point out bikes like the Africa Twin, even the T7, though it's obviously a totally different class of adventure bike. This styling has really sort of caught on, and this is a really good example of it. This bike is using Ducati's water-cooled 937 Testastrada engine. That's the bike you see in the Multistrada V2 and the Hypermotard. Though it's a pricey bike, it's really got loads of great options. This looks to be a real adventure bike, which is something Italian manufacturers haven't always done so well. Adventuring and touring have all kind of gotten mixed up with some of the European brands. But yeah, Desert X isn't a bike that I would buy, but I think for its class, it's pretty awesome. I believe the newest release from Honda, though there's a few honestly, but of note is the return of the iconic Honda Hornet. Now the Hornet name points back to the original naked version of the CBR 600, basically a naked super sport, and really a class-defining motorcycle in its day. Now this bike is a 750cc, so all in all, it's a CB 750 Hornet, so kind of a mashup of iconic bike names, except this bike has really nothing in common with either the CB750 or the Hornet. It's not a retro bike, it's not an inline 4, it's not a detuned super sport. This has a 750cc parallel twin, but despite that, it is a pretty revvy bike. So in that sense, it is kind of more in line with that character of the original Hornet. It makes over 90 horsepower, it's relatively lightweight, and just a, seemingly good all-arounder of a motorcycle. In terms of looks, I think it's probably, a bit divisive, this styling, but I really like it. It's honestly better than most of the bikes that Honda has put out in the last few years. This is not the kind of style that I would normally go for, but I think it looks great. It stands out among this class of sort of middleweight street bikes. The problem is it is such a high revving type of twin versus everything else that you could compare it with in terms of twins. So, many of the other options, whether it's Yamaha's middleweights or KTM's, those bikes are arguably going to be more fun because they're more punchy and more torquey. You don't have to rev them out as much. So personally, I don't know if I would go for this if I were shopping in this class, but all in all, pretty cool bike from Honda. Of course, the newest and only current motorcycle from BSA with their recent revival is the Gold Star 650. Now, I've talked at length about this bike. I made an entire video about it if you guys want a more critical opinion. But granted, I've never ridden it. I probably never will ride it, because I don't personally see this bike taking hold here in the US in any sort of way. I won't go on about why I don't really like this kind of retro bike. You guys can watch the video if you want to see that, but when everything is taken into consideration, there are some interesting aspects about it. It's a big thumpy single, which is cool and interesting and in line with their history and in line with the Gold Star's history, but then again, it has none of that good thumpy sound that I want from a big single, like, some of KTM's big singles. Also, in terms of competition, it doesn't look as good or cost as little or have the same support as the Royal Enfield Interceptor, so I don't totally get where this bike is going to succeed. It just looks like every other bike made by this group. It looks like the Jawas. I mean, it looks like it could be a Royal Enfield Meteor or something. I don't know, maybe old Goldie fans will get it, but I don't see the Gold Star 650 taking over the way the Interceptor has, but it's there. Now, Suzuki unveiled 2 new models at 2023 EICMA, the GSX 8S and the V-Strom 800DE. Both of these bikes are utilizing the same brand new parallel twin engine, and this is really exciting to see from Suzuki. They had not made an entirely new motorcycle in a very long time, like maybe decades. I'm going to focus on the GSX 8S because, personally, I like it more. And also, can we talk about just how influential KTM has been? This bike, the Hornet, Yamaha's middleweight nakeds, I mean, the Trident is in this class as well, but yeah, this is pretty much a KTM looking bike that just isn't orange. These bikes, a lot of them, I mean, not the Trident, but pretty much everything else in this class looks like KTM could have made it with that sort of futuristic Street Fighter look. Now, this bike is sort of a step up for SV650 riders. And listen, nobody does it like Suzuki. The SV650 is super outdated, but it's still reliable and practical, and it's just a great bike. And still cool, if you ask me. This is a bigger, more powerful version, and it does have more, I guess you'd say, modern styling. This is a bold bike for Suzuki. It produces less horsepower but more torque than the Hornet that we just talked about, which is definitely a comparable motorcycle. So in my opinion, better tuned probably for street riding. It weighs more. That's the one thing I would have loved to see down a bit. This bike is pretty heavy for what it is. And to me, these bikes have to be lightweight if they're going to compete with what KTM has to offer now that the Duke 790 is apparently coming back. And let me just be honest for a moment, just for comparison, because again, it's the gold standard in this class. The Duke 790, though again was gone for a little bit, now it's coming back, makes way more power, weighs way less, looks way cooler, and costs just a bit more. Maybe it'll be a little more now, but the price it was at before was just a couple $100 more than this Suzuki. I think if this bike were $7,000, it would be a knockout for Suzuki as sort of the Walmart of motorcycles. But why would I ever choose the Hornet or this bike over a Duke 790? I would go buy a used Duke 790 at this point because it just blows all of the options in this class out of the water from a pure riding standpoint. Maybe not the Trident. That bike is more performance oriented, but the 790 is going to be way more fun with that torquey twin. Regardless though, cool to see Suzuki actually developing a new platform for the street. Moto Guzzi is making waves like never before. Honestly, they've sort of floundered for years, but now their lineup is becoming more diverse. They're making good use of and modernizing that weird engine setup that they have. And the V100 Mandello is the latest iteration, and it's basically Moto Guzzi's attempt at making what we would call a sport tourer. No other motorcycle shows this desire to take the company into the future than the V100. This is an all-new, liquid-cooled iteration of the Transverse V Twin. This is kind of all of Moto Guzzi's history sort of culminating in being modernized in one motorcycle, and many would say that this is the engine of the future for them. There's loads of advancements with this bike beyond just the engine. I think we'll be seeing a lot of these things in their other platforms going forward. Now, in terms of the bike, it's a sport tourer, makes 115 horsepower and 77 foot-pounds of torque, just over 500 pounds wet, which is really pretty solid, honestly. Overall, I believe this is a pretty solid bike for its class of sport touring, but honestly, I don't really keep up with sport tourers, so you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure somebody, watching this can comment about their expertise about Moto Guzzi and sport touring. But anyways, the styling is interesting. I think it's a design that could grow on me. Everything from Moto Guzzi kind of does that. Like, I won't love it at first, and then ultimately it grows on me. But this big V-twin could lend itself really well to touring with all that low-end torque versus trying, to take a sport bike and turn it into a sport tourer. The latest motorcycle from Harley-Davidson is the Nightster, and I'm guessing many of you have seen this bike as it's kind of trending right now, along with the special version that recently just came out, which honestly looks even more like a toy. I don't know what it is, but the engine sitting on that traditional Harley-esque looking bike with all the radiator stuff up front now that it's liquid cooled, I just hate it so much. The new Revolution twins from Harley, they're not appealing looking machines. I don't understand it. Other companies have figured out how to make beautiful looking liquid cooled engines. I mean, look at Indian. All of Indian's engines are just awesome looking to me, and they look rugged. They maintain the sort of purposeful look that we got from old air-cooled twins from Harley and Indian. But these look like plastic toys. Overall, the looks just aren't for me. The Sportster S actually, in my opinion, is a much better looking bike than the Nightster, but they're both just kind of odd looking, and especially the engine. It's all about the engine and the aesthetic for me with Harley. So if you're going to kill the sound and you're going to kill the looks of the engine, I don't feel like the payoff is there. And I don't feel like bikes like this are really, they just don't make sense. Like, this is a cruiser, and I don't know that all the tech and all the features and the fact that it's liquid cooled is really what cruiser riders want. I mean, Harley's just stuck at this point. I don't know what Harley needs to do. But yeah, this bike is essentially a baby Sportster S. I will say with both these models, they have gotten the power up quite a bit with the weight down. I mean, technically speaking, these are better bikes than the bikes that they've replaced. They're more modern than the previous Sportsters. I mean, the previous Sportster lineup, they made like -7 horsepower and weighed just over 3,600 pounds. But to me, who cares? They sounded right. They sounded old. They looked the part. So for me, personally, these bikes just are not doing it for me. Now, I believe the newest motorcycle to come out of Kawasaki is the ZX4RR. Many of you will be familiar with the high-revving little inline fours of about 20 years ago from Japanese manufacturers like Honda and Kawasaki. And not too long ago, we saw Kawasaki bring out the 250cc version, basically of this bike, but that was only available in Japan. Well, this is a bigger, more powerful, sort of screaming baby inline four that is available now here in the US. Motobob has a great video going over this bike that you guys can check out. In fact, Motobob has videos about every bike, pretty much, that we've talked about. So check out his channel. But yeah, he has a really good video on this. What's really crazy is that this little 400cc inline four will be way out of its own class, like in terms of performance, comparing it to, say, even a Ninja 400. This is going to be much more performance oriented in terms of specs. It's almost going to be more in line with something like an R7. In some ways, a high-revving inline four does have more character, as you really can ream it out. But at the same time, high-revving inline fours aren't actually more fun for the street, for the most part. They're entirely gutless down low, and that's where a bike like an R7 is going to be a better option, in my opinion, for the price that this bike is at. More enjoyable. It's just going to be more fun than a bike that revs super high and doesn't make power until like 9,000, 10,000 RPM. In my opinion, this could be a great first track bike, kind of like a baby super sport versus getting like a 600cc super sport. If you're wanting to learn how to manage a high revving bike, this would be a really good option. And the price is almost $10,000. So I'm not sure who's going to buy this in the US, but I do think it's cool that Kawasaki is bringing one of their super high revving inline fours to the US. For the past few years, we haven't seen any all new bikes from Indian. The FTR lineup has had some new additions, so I believe technically the latest Indian motorcycle would be the Challenger line from 2020. So it's been about 3 years since we've seen a completely new Indian. The Challenger was and obviously is a competitor to Harley's high-end Road Glide line. In this class of big, expensive, tech-focused cruisers, the Challenger is, for many, arguably a better option than the Road Glide. They're similar in price, similar in tech, but the Challengers are quite a bit more powerful and they weigh less. Obviously, there's way more to it than just that. It's all about what you want in a bike, and they both have different options, but yeah. Challenger line, technically the newest motorcycle for Indian. The latest all-new motorcycle to come out of Aprilia is the Touareg 660. Utilizing the same engine as the RS 660, arguably the best bike in its class with that awesome triple. The Touareg is a sort of middleweight or even lightweight adventure bike with that same Dakar T7 style. This bike truly is a viable competitor to the T7, a bit more expensive, but it's got more tech, and I think the styling is absolutely amazing. This bike is the coolest looking adventure bike I think I've ever seen. I love it. I would totally own one in a heartbeat, and I personally find adventure bikes rather ugly. Also though, I think it's the video that Aprilia made where the bike is like being put together. That video kind of sold me. The only fear I have with buying a bike like this is that you kind of beat up adventure bikes. And if you're not going to take it off road, I don't really understand the point of this bike. I personally would want that Yamaha reliability and service dependability versus owning an Aprilia. I wouldn't worry as much if this were a Ducati, but Aprilia still to this day does not have the track record that the big Japanese brands have for just getting your bike worked on and doing it in a timely manner, and, personally, probably be better off with a T7 still. There's quite a few bikes from KTM that could be mentioned. the RC8C, the Duke 790. These are bikes that are returning, but these aren't entirely new motorcycles. Technically, the latest all-new model from KTM, in terms of street bikes, I believe is the Duke 890, which came out in like 2020. I mean, it's hard with KTM because they're always changing existing models and discontinuing models and bringing them back and replacing non-R models with R models. But yeah, I believe the 890, which is still present in their lineup, would constitute the most recent all-new motorcycle from KTM. But again, it's built on the back of the 790 that came before it. So in many ways, the 790 would really be the latest all-new model, with that, I believe, being the first parallel twin for KTM. I'll be interested to see if KTM comes out with something totally unique in the next few years. I believe they are. Maybe a fully fledged electric adventure bike? I don't know. Honestly, what I think KTM needs to do is make a sort of R7 competitor, like a 790, but fully fared, but not the 8C. That thing is just ridiculous. It's too expensive. But like a sport bike built on one of these platforms would be fantastic. Next up, we have Triumph, and technically the latest motorcycle from Triumph would be the Tiger 660, based again on the same platform as the Trident. You've got that trusty triple from old street triples. This bike is kind of like a baby sport tourer. Seems to be aimed at bikes like the Versys 650, which on paper doesn't hold a candle to the Tiger 660. But this bike is a little bit more, like $600 more. To me, seems worth it though. I guess it depends on what style you like. If you want a more sort of Dakar style, something like a T7 or Touareg would be the way to go. These bikes really do have more of a sport touring aesthetic, but again, like the Touareg, I actually really like this bike. I think it's really nice looking. But again, this is going to be more road focused than those sort of middleweight adventure bikes. Next up, we have Royal Enfield, and the latest bike from Royal Enfield is the Super Meteor 650, built on the existing twin platform of bikes like the Interceptor. This motorcycle is a no-brainer for Royal Enfield after the success of the twins and also of the Baby Meteor, which I believe is a 350. This is a bike that is much more capable and more suited to American roads, which I'm sure is at least in part the targeted audience for Royal Enfield in making a little bit bigger cruiser. I've said this before, this is the bike that Harley needed to make like 10 years ago. A lighter, smaller, more affordable, more accessible cruiser that still looks the part and is well executed. I'm not even a cruiser fan, and I think this bike looks awesome. It has that shiny, chromy, premium classic look that you want from a bike like this, not the plastic looking crap that we seem to keep seeing from Harley. All right, last but not least, we have MV Agusta, and the latest bike from the Italian boutique is the Super Veloce 1000, sort of combination of two bikes, the Rush and Brutale 1000 platform, which is ultimately based on the older F4, big inline four. But then now we've got the retro Super Veloce bodywork. Now, as much as this bike is really cool, two things. I wish they had just brought back maybe like an all-new F4. Like if they're going to build a sport bike on this platform, I think it would have been cool if they had just came out with a completely new F4 with new styling. That would have been awesome. But they got rid of Adrian Morton, and that would have been the guy to do it. If anybody's going to be tasked with designing an all-new F4, that's a pretty big job. But also, I just don't love that the sleek, simple aesthetic of the Super Veloce is kind of lost when you add things like fins for this bike. I believe this bike's going to cost like 60 grand out of the gate, which is partially because, you're starting with the Siri Oro version, but still, pretty cool, exotic bike as always from MV Agusta. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know if I missed a model, as that is entirely possible, and let us know if any of these new motorcycles are of interest to you. We'll see you guys in the next one. Ride safe.